In the 2019 manifesto, the one in which they got an 80-seat majority, the Conservatives promised that when it came to vital public services and strikes, they would put through legislation to give us a minimum level of service and to do so in order to protect the public. Grant Shapps was up this morning before the House of Commons proposing this legislation.
To deny and to vote against legislation that brings in minimum safety levels to help our constituents is to attack their security and their welfare.
OK, that was Shapps putting out the case. So what do we think? Is this the right thing to do? You know, is it right that we make sure that there is some level of ambulance service, of A&E service, or whatever else it may be, with fire brigade, whatever else it may be? Is that the right thing to do, or is it an outrageous attack on the rights of the individual to withhold their labour? I have to say, there are not many things this government puts forward that I think are right, but I think this does make sense to me. Now, of course, there are all sorts of definitions as to what that minimum level of service would be. And would people who rejected it really get sacked and not be able to claim unfair dismissal? We're getting into deeper legal arguments that I can deal with, but I am joined by Amanda Lennon, employment lawyer, who not only deals with these things, but has read the legislation. So it's quite clear that the government are trying to honour a manifesto commitment, which I do applaud, and we can argue the rights and wrongs of this. Having seen what Shapps has put down today before the Commons, what is your response?
My view is that this is the government pushed into a last resort scenario, and I believe that this particular timing, at least, stems from the fact that before Christmas, the unions representing the ambulance drivers refused to agree certain minimum levels of service in advance if the ambulance drivers went on strike. And so this is an obvious reaction to that. But in putting this bill forward, Grant Shapps has also included lots of other sectors that provide public services, such as transport and the NHS and the fire service. So it's quite a broad brush, and we will need tightly worded regulations to make sure that these powers can't be abused by employers.
So on the one hand, he's showing the country he's tough because we're in the grip of many simultaneous strikes. But in reality, this consultation process, this attempt to define what a minimum level of service is and to pass all this into law, it's going to take a couple of years, isn't it?
Well, I think that this is an example of something that will be very much brought forward, just as the debate on being able to bring in agency workers to cover striking workers last year. So I believe it will be debated next week, and then it will pass to the House of Lords. It may go back with changes or rejections, who knows? But I think this is one of the acts that will be sped up, given the severity of the situation.
OK, but we still have to have that consultation.
Yes, we do.
We still have to have that definition.
Yeah.
Now, is it, just trying to be even-handed about, by the way, I think this is the right legislation, and I remember the last time a Conservative government put through radical trade union reform in the mid-1980s, it did make this country a place foreign investors wanted to come to. So I think there are times when this is the right thing to do. But would it take away, or could it, let me ask you that, could it take away the basic rights in a free society of workers to withhold their labour?
Well, in one sense, it is quite undemocratic, and that's what the unions have been saying today in response to this news. Because if you follow the rules on balloting and you get to the point where you've got lawful strike action, the employer in these sectors can, at pretty much the last minute, say, you're not going to leave me with enough to provide a minimum service, so I'm going to put the brakes on that. So in that sense, it does fundamentally undermine the right of workers to go on strike in those sectors.
And what about the right of people if they had a heart attack to get an ambulance?
Well, that's the other side of the coin, isn't it? And I think that there's going to be a lot of public support for this bill because of the impact on public services. And we've heard horror stories of people waiting hours and hours for ambulances and waiting in hospitals in the corridor.
Mind you, the truth is they were doing that before any strikes were happening anyway.
I'm sure they were, but I think it's come to the fore now. Because the sides have been so polarised before Christmas in their pay negotiations. They've reached a stalemate, and the government's now taking these drastic steps to try and unpick that, I think.
Given that a lot of employment law and legislation when we were members of the European Union was effectively coming from there. Is this a piece of legislation that would have been much harder to propose if we were still EU members?
I don't think it would necessarily, because there are lots of countries in the EU that have a similar law. And it's important to note this is not a general veto by the employer to avoid people going on strike. It's very much used in specific circumstances to provide minimum levels of service. So that doesn't mean that all workers will be stopped from going on strike. That type of principle operates in several countries in Europe already.
Okay.
For example, Germany, France, Italy, Spain.
OK.
So it's not uncommon.
It's not uncommon. No, look, well, it's going to be very, very interesting about it. Come back and tell us at some point what this minimum level of service actually is, because it seems to me that much of this will hinge around that. And in particular, how long this game of parliamentary ping-pong could potentially
I think so.
go on for. Thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you.